for joining us tonight for the Beach Nourishment Public Information Session. With me tonight is Leslie Fields from the Woods Hole Group, and also Greg Guimond in the back of the room, Marshfield Town Planner. I'm Sheila Scarzi, I'm the Duxbury DPW Director.
All right, thank you, Sheila. I'm going to give just a brief presentation about the project, but I also wanted to point out that we have two staff from CZM, Rebecca Haney, Jason Burtner in the audience. They were instrumental in providing funding. Well, their agency was instrumental in providing funding for this project.
Sheila.
Oh, and also in the back of the room, we have Rainey Reed, Duxbury Town Manager.
Okay, how am I advancing this slide? Oh, you're doing it, okay, fine. Okay. Welcome everyone, my name is Leslie Fields. I work for the Woods Hole Group, and we are the consulting firm that has been working for both towns since, I think, 2020 on this project. I'm the project manager from Woods Hole Group on this project to build shoreline resiliency in Marshfield and Duxbury through beach and dune nourishment. Slide, please. This slide just gives you a brief overview of what I'm going to be talking about. I'm just going to reiterate what the project goals are. I will talk a little bit about the sediment that we were required to bring in to nourish the beach with, what its composition was made up of. I'm going to show a series of pre- and post-nourishment photographs. We'll also be talking about requirements for monitoring of endangered and threatened shorebirds. I'm going to talk about some opportunities for future nourishment, and then we'll take questions and comments. Next slide, please. So project goals, the main goal of this project was to enhance the resiliency of critically eroded beaches along the towns of Marshfield and Duxbury. In this case, specifically in the areas south of Green Harbor. And why are we doing that? To protect public and private properties from storm damage, to protect the existing seawalls and revetments that both towns have invested in, either through reconstruction or repair, and to minimize wave overtopping and flooding, to restore the recreational beach by adding additional material, and to restore the coastal ecosystem. All right, next slide. Okay, so this slide here just gives you a few of the highlights of the construction that went on this winter. So we were out there working for 9 weeks, between December 26th and February 23rd. We placed a total of 85,935 cubic yards of material. Of that, 30,778 cubic yards was placed in Marshfield, and 55,157 cubic yards in Duxbury. So if you look at that graphic on the left, that yellow area that's running sort of north-south, that's the area that we nourished. So that runs from 109 Gurnett Road to 64 Bay Ave. You'll also notice another line on that graph, which is sort of a dashed orange line, which is longer and wider. That is the designed project for this area. That's the one we permitted. It's much bigger than what we built. In fact, that bigger project calls for 480,640 cubic yards. So we only placed 18% of the original design for the project this winter. 36% in Marshfield and 14% in Duxbury. So if we're to build out the entire project, we've got another 394,705 cubic yards to go. So I bring that up. It's going to come back sort of a thread throughout this presentation, just to sort of, set the stage for the fact that we've got a bigger project that we designed. We didn't build it all. We built a part of it, and there's sort of ramifications of that, which I'll get into in a little bit. Next slide. As far as construction funding goes, this slide shows the funding that was issued, both grant funding to both towns as well as match funding provided by both towns. So you'll see that the town of Marshfield was issued $1.2 million in grant funding for this project, the construction of this project. Duxbury, $2 million for construction. In terms of match funding, Marshfield has contributed over $15,000 of in-kind match funds and $350,000 in cash towards this project. Duxbury has provided $10,000 in match funds and $727,340 in cash match for construction. Next slide. In terms of the sediment that was used for the nourishment, I know I've talked about this before, but we were required to use material that was compatible with what was on the beach before we started. So that meant a mixture of sand, gravel, and cobble. So what I'm showing here is that the left photograph is a photograph of, on the pile on the left is a pile of what we call gravel, smaller material, and then the pile on the right is a pile of cobble. And then we also had large quantities of sand mixed with gravel that was brought in from a site in Plymouth. That material was mixed at a specified ratio with these two other sand sources to develop the required sediment compositions. The middle photo is a photo post-construction that shows that we do have a mixture of sand, cobble, and gravel on the beach. And the photo on the right is one that we took before construction when we were trying to quantify what the characteristics of the beach were, just showing that we did before construction have that sort of coarser cobble and gravel mix. Next slide. Okay, so the next 5 or 6 slides are ones that are pre and post construction. So I'm going to point out a few things. At the top of this slide, the white dashed line is the footprint that we worked within, and the dots show you where these photos were taken. And the yellow arrow at the top shows the direction in which the photograph was taken. So for example, this first one that we're looking at was really taken south of the project footprint, so outside the project footprint, looking to the south. The bottom left picture is a pre-nourishment picture, the bottom right is post-nourishment. And so pre-nourishment was taken in October of 23, post-nourishment was taken earlier in March. We were just out there yesterday taking photos again. And I would say that, we could post another one here to the right, which would show something a little bit different. But basically what we're seeing here is that in October 23, high tide was approximately 10 to 15 feet off the seawall. And in this photo earlier in March, it was more like 50 feet off the seawall. When we were out there yesterday, it was more like about probably 20 feet off the seawall, but the elevation of the beach is higher than it was in October. All right, next slide. Okay, so again, just pay attention to the yellow dot at the top. This is a photograph taken in Duxbury, south of the horseshoe area, looking north. And so, again, pre-nourishment on the left, post-nourishment on the right, and I've put like a white line across the revet, or across the seawall there that shows sort of the change in elevation of the beach between the two photographs. So we brought the beach up in elevation in this area as of early March 2024 by about 1 foot to 1.5 feet. All right, next slide, please. Okay, this one is taken from the horseshoe area looking south. And again, pre-nourishment, post-nourishment, left and right, and you can see the elevation of the beach in this little corner of the horseshoe area is about 1 foot higher than it was before construction. Next slide. So this here is looking, again, south towards the horseshoe, and this is again, we're in Duxbury still. This is the seawall that's immediately at the northern end of the horseshoe. And I've circled a little part of rebar that you can see on the photographs. And on the left photograph, it's about 1.5 to 2 feet above the level of the beach. In the right photograph, it's right at the elevation of the beach. So here we've brought the elevation of the beach up by about 1.5 to 2 feet. Next slide, please. This is taken from the same area, north of the horseshoe, sort of just looking out across the beach. And one thing I wanted to just point out here was that we are, matching composition of the beach pretty well. So on the left, we've got a mixture of sand with some patches of gravel and cobble, and we've got the same sort of thing on the right. All right, next picture. Right, this is up in Marshfield at the Bay Ave ramp, and you can see that the actual concrete part of the ramp and a lot of the riprap stones around the ramp are now completely covered with sand. So we've brought the level of the beach up there by 3 or 4 feet in this case. And then the last one here is also taken in Marshfield at the very northern end of the project, looking south. And here you can see that at the time this March photo was taken, high water was approximately 20 to 30 feet off the seawall as compared to having it right off the toe stones. In the pre-nourishment photograph, I think also you can see the elevation of the beach in the right-hand photo is higher because there's fewer of those toe stones, revetment stones that you can see. All right, next slide, please. All right, so I talked before about the fact that we only placed 18% of what the original design was. The reason we only placed 18% was because of funding and because of time. So we didn't have time to build a whole 480,000 cubic yard project, nor was the funding available. But it was still important that we get as much out on the beach as we could because it provides a benefit. When we did our original calculations for the original design, we estimated that it would take about 5 years. Every 5 years you'd need to come back and re-nourish the beach. That is based on calculations that show that 80% of the material that you placed after 5 years is sort of moved outside the footprint. Either it's sort of moved offshore to the nearshore zone, or it's moved to the north or south. So that's what that 5-year re-nourishment calculation is based on. Again, we only built 18% of that permitted project, so we expect that this material to spread more rapidly than the original design. It's going to move both north and south and into the near shore until that beach reaches an equilibrium profile. So the photograph or the graphic on the left just shows sort of at the top, an initial beach nourishment cross-section. After 1 year, if you go down one graphic, you can see that much of the material in the high tide beach is now moved off into the near shore. So the toe of that nourishment is now further moved off into the near shore area. And then if you go down one more graphic, after 2 to 5 years, you've got continued movement of material into the near shore, and you can't see it on that graph, but also to the north and south outside of the nourishment footprint. So after 5 years, then re-nourishment is recommended. The middle graphic just shows sort of the cross-shore transport as well as transport to the north and south. All right, next photo. Okay, I think it's also important to note, and I'm sure those of you who live on the beach know this, that there are seasonal changes in the beach. So in the summer, what we tend to see is a wider beach because the smaller, calmer waves tend to bring material that's in the near shore back up onto the beach. And then in winter, when you have higher water levels, bigger waves, a lot of that material gets eroded and pulled off and many times deposited in a sandbar in the near shore area. And we do have that here on both beaches that we've seen and mapped. The good thing about that sandbar is that it will attenuate and break wave energy as it approaches the beach. So as those waves approach the beach, they reach an area that's shallower, less water depth, and so they break out there as opposed to on the beach and up against the seawall. So the sandbar there is helpful in protecting the beach. All right, next slide. Okay, now I'm going to get into shorebird monitoring. Many of the permits that we got for these projects require monitoring of endangered and threatened shorebirds. In fact, both orders of conditions, both visa determinations, and both Army Corps general permits require monitoring of these birds. In fact, they require that the monitoring needs to be done in compliance with state and federal guidelines for recreational beaches. And I point that out specifically because the two guidelines that I show here, one is state and the bottom is federal, have sections or guidelines for recreational beaches. They also have guidelines for beaches that have off-road vehicles, and they're different. We are only required to monitor according to recreational beach use. That's what we have here. We don't have ORVs. It's not like DVR down south. So they're a little bit less stringent than the ones that have ORV use on them. Those guidelines do require a certified bird monitor, a shorebird monitor, and both towns have been in discussions with Mass Audubon to provide those services. I know that the town of Marshfield has signed their contract with Mass Audubon, and the town of Duxbury is in negotiations with Mass Audubon about doing that work for them this season. Next slide. Okay, as far as what those monitoring requirements are, I'm going to spend some time on this slide. Symbolic fencing, which is pictured here in this upper right photo. It's not sand fencing, it's just what's shown here in this photo. So small sort of skinny post, almost like a piece of rebar with twine in between, and periodically there'll be signs that say, you know, why the fencing is here and what you can and can't do. That fencing may be placed in areas of prime shorebird habitat as early as April 1. And that's going to be something that Mass Audubon will decide when they come out to the beach. I think they would start that, sort of doing their recon work as early as next week to determine this. If that fencing goes up, it will be above the high tide line, so there'll still be room to walk below the high tide line. At high tide, there'll still be room to walk. So at high tide, you can still walk on the beach and stay outside this fenced area. And Mass Audubon is the only agency that is authorized to install it, to move it, or to remove it. So it's not as though the residents can come in and remove it. It's not as though the towns can come in and remove it. It's up to Mass Audubon to do this. I will say that when we were out there yesterday, and I have a few photos that we can look at later, I went there an hour after high tide. There was really, in most cases, very little beach, left for them to put this fencing up. So, in my opinion, there's little chance they're going to put up this symbolic fencing along the whole beach. It's just, I don't think it's going to happen because it's not prime habitat. Let's see, so what they will be doing in April is doing this surveillance survey. So twice a week, they'll be out there walking along the beach a couple hours each day, looking for signs of the birds. This will likely happen through April into May. If they see signs of birds, so if they see territorial behavior of birds, sort of trying to find a place to make a nest, or if they see a place where they have nested, they're going to put up symbolic fencing to protect those birds. That's a requirement, and they will have to do that. If they see that activity and that fencing goes up, they're going to bump their surveys up to 5 days a week until the birds have hatched the eggs, and until the chicks have hatched and the chicks have fledged, which usually occurs sometimes in mid to late April, August. If we don't see any bird activity at all, and there's fencing that goes up, and that's an if, then that fencing would be removed by mid-July. Okay. What are the things that you can do on the beach? If the fencing goes up, if there's birds, you can still walk on the beach. You can walk anywhere outside the fenced area. You can walk with your dogs on a leash outside the fenced area. Dogs on leashes are requirements in both towns. That's something that can be enforced at the municipal level. You can fly kites so long as you're 200 feet or greater from the fencing. We know that a lot of people who live along the seawall have stairways that go down to the beach. We are recommending that those stairways go in before April 1, and if possible, if you could share with your neighbors so that every other house would have a set of stairs. Maybe you walk along the top of the seawall and use your neighbor's steps. That's a recommendation. Not a requirement, it's just a recommendation. When Mass Audubon is on the site, if they see signs of territorial behavior or bird nesting, they will report this to the towns, and then the towns they'll report the address of that to the towns, and then the towns will contact the property owners. If you haven't put out your stairway and you still want to, then you'll need to coordinate with Mass Audubon on getting that stairway in, so that the birds are not harassed or damaged or killed. It's also important to note that if the stairways are there and the birds for some reason try to nest or have territorial behavior around the stairs, it's possible those stairs could be closed off until the birds leave. And you would be notified of that. And then I also just note that fireworks and bonfires are things that sort of deter the birds. They are not allowed by local regulations, and so that's also something that could be enforced. Next slide. Okay, in terms of enforcement, I want to make it clear that Mass Audubon is not out there to enforce all of these regulations and rules. They are simply there to monitor the beach and to provide education to the people who are using the beach, to let them know what they should and shouldn't be doing. Enforcement of those things that were on the previous slide is up to the local towns. If Mass Audubon is out there and they see signs of harassment of birds, or if they see signs of some sort of mortality of the birds that they feel is caused by human activity, it's possible they would file an incident report with Mass Division of Fish and Wildlife. Once Mass Division of Fish and Wildlife gets that, they will make a determination as to whether or not a take or a mortality of endangered species has occurred. And that's a pretty serious thing. So if that happens, it could either result in a fine for the towns in which it occurred, or it could require the towns to obtain something called a conservation management permit. And if that happens, then there'd likely be restrictions on things you could and couldn't do on the beach. It's not really something that you want. There is a conservation management permit, for example, at DBR, and they have to adhere to many rules and regulations about what they can and can't do. And then it's also just a note that, it's in your best interest to try to adhere to these regulations and rules, because incidents that are reported just jeopardize the ability to do projects in the future. Next slide. Okay, and on a positive note, project highlights. So we did increase in width and elevation of the high tide beach and the intertidal beach. So in so doing, we added protection for both public and private infrastructure from wave overtopping. We supplied material to a critically starved, sediment-starved system. We enhanced recreational beaches. We had a shortened period of construction, as I said, only 9 weeks. We were thinking it was going to be 3 months. We do know that there are still trucks out there working on a project at Duxbury Beach Reservation. We do expect those trucks to be wrapping up sometime next week. And we also just want to point out that the investment that the towns put into this, and CZM put into this project, it's really protecting the other investments that the towns have made in seawall repairs and reconstruction. Next slide. This is the last one I have. So just highlighting again the fact that the towns have gotten a considerable amount of funding from Coastal Zone Management through their Coastal Resiliency Program since 2020. So the first grant was for $234,000 for engineering of this project. The next 3 years we spent about $375,000 on permitting, and then this last year, FY24, all told between both towns, $4.3 million for construction. So all told, we've gotten grants. The towns have gotten grants for $4.9 million to build this project. There are further grant opportunities available for additional construction. So the grant programs for the Coastal Resiliency Program through CZM will be opening up soon. And the Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Program has already taken their grant season. We could work with the towns if they're interested in filing for more grant applications to do future construction. I understand that the town of Marshfield is interested in filing a grant, or likely interested in filing a grant sometime in June through the Coastal Resiliency Program. And we hope and recommend that the town of Duxbury also follows suit. They do have a 25% match this year. It's not, I understand from talking to town manager in Duxbury that, you don't have anywhere near what you had this year for a match, but, it's worth considering, you know, what you can come up with and trying to continue incrementally putting material on this beach, these beaches. And that's the last slide, and I'm more than happy to answer questions. Yes? Do you want to identify yourself?
John Verity. I
And the
live at
microphone,
11
sir.
John, can you go to the microphone?
John Verity, 11 Ocean Road South. So will the Audubon group be outside of your yellow marked earlier part of the beach that you renourished?
It's my understanding that they won't. They're only required to monitor, you know, what we nourished. And one person I didn't introduce is Lyra Brennan from Mass Audubon. If there's questions I can't answer, I may defer some of these questions to Lyra. Did I answered that correctly, right? Yes. Okay.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Alicia Babcock, 9 Ocean Road South. Hi, Leslie.
Hello.
I have some comments and questions,
Okay.
and I don't want you to take this in a way that we're not grateful for the sand, because we really are, and we're so happy that we have replenished part of the beach. But I think I'm speaking on behalf of a lot of the residents in the area who are very surprised that this whole fencing and short road monitoring has come up. This was a big topic of discussion when we signed easements. We've got documentation going back and forth with emails with Valerie Massard, saying that she consulted with you and Woods Hole Group and the town, and that we were assured none of this would happen. No symbolic fencing, no monitoring, none of that was going to be required. And we all signed easements based on that. That paperwork went back and forth many, many times until the residents were comfortable with what they were signing. And now this feels like a big backpedal. A lot of this just doesn't work. It doesn't work from an enforcement perspective, because there are people that walk on this beach. The public walks on this beach day and night. And these those of us that live along the wall, I don't want to be responsible for somebody who crosses. What happens if some kids at night are walking and there's a bird at the bottom of the steps I have going over the wall? I'm going to get fined for that. I'm going to get punished, or the town's going to get punished. It doesn't work. We also have video documentation from March 10th, after the Nourishment was down. The water is up and smashing and hitting the wall. There really is no beach still. I mean, it's better, it's higher, but it's not really keeping the water back as far as I think everybody had anticipated.
Do you want to start responding to some
Sure,
of those?
go right
Or
ahead.
lose the
Yep.
train of thought in a minute
Yep,
here.
go ahead, yep.
Okay, on the first point, I saw some of the emails that went back and forth with Val. The comments were, are you going to plant grass? We said no, and we haven't. The comments were, are you going to put up sand fencing? We haven't. We never said we weren't going to monitor for birds. We never said there would not be symbolic fencing. It was sand fencing and beach grass. So.
Okay, well, these are semantics, really. I mean, we don't necessarily talk your language specifically.
Yeah, okay.
Fencing to us is fencing.
Mhm.
I mean, whether it's symbolic or it's sand fencing or whatever. I mean, you're roping off an area of the beach.
Yeah, it's temporary.
Well,
If it goes up at all, it's
Okay.
temporary,
it's temporary for most of the summer.
potentially, if it goes up at all.
And this is what I'm saying. So it's almost impossible. And I don't know why we're encouraging a situation with birds when we don't have one. And I'd also like to bring to your attention that this post-construction requirements, it does say that symbolic fencing installation will begin on March on known plover breeding territories to prepare for the start of plover bonding and territory establishment in early April. This is not a known plover breeding territory. We've never had birds. There's never been a problem. So I don't understand why we're fencing around an area that has no known bird activity. In addition to that, we're about to start a seawall construction project, which I don't know how you're gonna fence and then have all this heavy construction equipment coming down and disrupting it all. So the whole thing just doesn't seem feasible. And I personally am a little upset that the beach is going to be potentially roped off like that, without us being notified in advance. If this was all part of the grant, there was ample opportunity to negotiate with CZM, to negotiate with NEHSP, to notify the residents. None of this came up until the 11th hour, and there were plenty of public outreach opportunities to discuss this. So I'm curious, was this an oversight, or what happened?
It wasn't an oversight, and it was discussed in some of the previous public meetings. It was definitely discussed when we went to the conservation commissions, and we submitted the permits, and when the permits were issued. So it wasn't an oversight, and it's not CZM's job to negotiate enforcement of state and federal guidelines for protection of endangered and threatened shorebirds. Maybe we should have done a better job of communicating to the public, but it wasn't an oversight. We did talk about it.
Okay, but again, going back to the conversations that we had and all the discussions signing the easements, if this was anticipated, then this should have been discussed, because clearly people were concerned about this, and it all of a sudden feels like, a last minute switch here.
I apologize for that. Like I said, if we could have done a better job communicating, but it wasn't as though we were trying to hide it from people, and it was discussed at certain public meetings, and definitely we went to the conservation commissions in both towns.
Well, I do feel like it was discussed last year when we were talking about the concept of it, but once we started to have the public outreach meetings and the grant was, we were partnering up with Marshfield, and we were actually getting the grant and we had the money, this was not discussed. So I don't know if anybody else from the neighborhood wants to speak to this, but.
Candace Martin, 59 Granite Road. A couple of points of clarification. So our permits cover 100% of the scope. We only did 18. So at the completion of the project means 100%. So why are we imposing something that's not complete yet? Another point of clarification, right now, it's improved. Definitely the situation, the wave height is lower. It's still, like, you can come out at the beach when it's a 9-foot tide and say, look at all that beach. Well, come when it's regularly 10 and a half, 11, and it's hitting the seawall 90% of the time. So that's a little bit misrepresentation of showing there's so much beach at high tide now. Last week, I'm in the area where there's no seawall, it's beach. And last week, it was beyond the seawall up to where there's supposed to be sand dunes, what's left of them. Mm-hmm. So high tide is still no beach. And my area did not get beach nourishment. You show it, it's part of that. So am I excluded? Because that means I can't even go onto the beach.
Yeah, so you're talking about the horseshoe area, right?
Yes.
I don't know, that's what I call it. I hope that's,
Yes.
you guys know what I mean when I'm talking about that. We didn't nourish that. I don't expect that we need to monitor that. We're only required to monitor areas that we nourished. To answer one of your first questions, even though we only put down 18% of the material, we did potentially create habitat that's good for these birds that are endangered and threatened. So if we create something by the guidelines and the birds show up, we need to protect them.
Right, understood, but we've proven that there's no bird habitat at high tide.
In most of the beaches, I completely agree with you.
So there's no known bird activity,
Yep.
and there's no opportunity for birds nesting. So I would say monitoring is not required at this time, and we should have a formal response that this will be evaluated at the next phases of the project.
Okay, I'm just gonna respond to that. So monitoring is required by the permits. We need to do it. If they find that there's no birds there, then, they won't put up the fencing. If it's not suitable habitat, they won't put up the fencing, but they will continue to monitor through the season.
Could you read the portion of the permit? The permit covers 100% of the beach, and we're not done yet. So it says at the completion of the project, not at the completion of 18%, that really didn't have a significant impact to the high tide beach area.
Yeah,
So that's what I'm asking for clarification, and I don't expect you to answer tonight, because I really think we should challenge this before we say we need somebody walking out there 2 times a week, maybe 5 times a week. It's impossible for birds to nest in deep water.
I completely agree with you. Anytime we create a beach that enhances habitat for shorebirds, they're gonna have this requirement. It's a state and federal requirement. It's in the permits. Even though we only built 18% of the project, we still have to do it. I agree with you that, based on conditions I saw yesterday when I walked the beach an hour after high tide, there's little to no habitat out there that's suitable for these birds. They're still gonna be out there looking. I talked about the summer profile. Maybe something will build back up and it will become suitable habitat. If so, Mass Audubon will be there to protect these birds.
But you'll amend their scope, so it's not that full section, so that my.
I'm sorry, can you go back to Mike?
They can't hear you. They can't hear you. Oh, sorry.
Thank you.
But you will modify the request to exclude the area that is a beach, that has sandy area.
Yeah, I don't need to modify their contract because what it says is you need to monitor the areas that were nourished.
Okay, you showed the yellow band, okay.
So the yellow band does include the areas nourished. It didn't include the horseshoe. We didn't go back up in there.
So what happens if the symbolic fencing goes up and we have a king tide or a storm or something and all of that rebar washes into the ocean? Isn't that kind of dangerous?
It is, and so that's why, we think there's likely, especially early on in the season where we do sort of tend to get some of these more stormy events with higher waves, we don't expect them to be able to put down the fencing because of just what you're talking about.
And so how is this possible fencing going to coordinate with seawall construction?
That I don't know.
Well, I think that we need to figure that out before we agree
I'm-
to doing that.
I'm not at all certain that seawall construction is going to happen this summer. I'm surprised that it can happen in an area that's potentially bird habitat. I'm not aware of what the permits say.
No, we are doing
I don't
seawall
know.
construction. We're about to go out to bid
Okay,
next
all right,
month, and
okay.
we're all teed up for it.
Okay,
And we have money set aside, so that project is happening, and the seawall is the reason why we did the nourishment. The nourishment was so that we could build seawall, so that is happening.
so
And it's happening this year, so
would say
it's
that-
colliding with this.
if there's construction going on, there's not going to be shorebirds there. They're not going to monitor that area. Yeah, Randy's got something.
Just to help clarify on the seawall construction, I'm Randy Reed, I'm the town manager here in Duxbury. The target time for the construction would be, we hope, once we get all the permits squared away, we hope to start the seawall construction on the northernmost end of it, probably mid to end of May. So that's what we're looking at for that. Can you run that video? Believe me, I've been meeting with you folks for the last 5 or 6 years, and I think we've all gotten to know each other pretty well. I understand your perspective, believe me. To come this far and then get all the money and boy, all of a sudden it's like, wow, we gotta do this? Okay, this is interesting. I thought that, and I wanna thank Jeff for sending this over. I thought this was rather telling. Not a lot of beach area there. As you can see, the habitat itself is pretty much underwater. Might present a challenge to create a nest. But that again is what, a week ago or so? Is that what it
That was March 10th.
March 10th?
Last week.
Yeah, so last week. That's what it was then. Who knows what it'll be once they get out there and start looking. But yeah, we are required to do this. It's a condition of the permit, whether complete or not, we have to do it. And the reason I hadn't signed the contract is I wanted to have this meeting first, see where things, how they all kind of played out. But we're gonna have to do something. My preference, personally, is I wanted what's called observational fencing, meaning if a bird is observed, then the fence goes up.
Right.
Not the proactive symbolic fencing. I mean, it's gonna be symbolic fencing either way. I didn't really think it made sense to fence everything in advance of the birds. I know that for years, the DVR has very carefully monitored where the birds are year after year after year to make sure that they're understanding where the locations are so that we can anticipate what the impacts will be. But this area where you folks live has never been part of that. So, I mean, there could be hundreds of them out there, there could be none of them, I don't know. But it's not something that we've monitored, so this is brand new for Mass Audubon to come out there and take a look. So with conditions like you saw in the video there, I don't know what they're gonna see or what they're gonna find, but personally, I'm a fan of the idea of the observational fencing. See what you see and then put it up afterwards if it's necessary. It seems to me
That's
the
logical.
most reasonable approach.
That's logical. I also just want to let you know how the flow works there in the summer too, just so that everybody understands. The residents along the seawall, are fortunate that, they've got a little plot maybe in the front of their house. They can sit up at the wall and look at the beach. The entire neighborhood behind, all of those people have rights to the beach, and they walk down the right-of-ways, and they sit at high tide, and they use the beach. So if this is all fenced off, you're eliminating all of that from happening. A lot of people rent their homes, they're rented in advance. Renters, are a transient population. They're not necessarily rule followers like this. There's just so many things that can go wrong, and possibly, the homeowners that live along the wall will get fined and blamed for some of these things, and I just really don't see how this is going to work.
Okay, I do want to point out that, the individual homeowner, I believe, is not going to be fined. Larry, do you
I
have?
can speak to that.
Okay, all right, do you
Couple
want
other
to?
concerns. Should I come back?
Yeah. I've never heard of an individual homeowner being fined, but let's see what Lyra has to say.
So the fencing, hi everyone, I absolutely understand a lot of the concerns that are coming up, so I just want to highlight a few things that might ease your minds. So in terms of responsibility of the landowner or the homeowner, there are situations in which, let's choose a random town like Chatham, where someone has a beautiful private beach and a plover shows up. It is their responsibility to make sure that there's nothing that happens to that plover or that nest. Once you hire Mass Audubon, our job is to remove that liability piece, right? So if we come out, let's say in a scenario where there is existing habitat, private plovers do show interest in it, they initiate the nesting cycle. By putting up the fencing, we are removing that burden, right? So you use the example of let's say a out-of-towner, excited teenager coming down and going into the fencing and engaging in some bad behavior. That's not the homeowner's responsibility. So the way that we work with enforcement, let's say again, let's say that 5 things occur. Some habitat is available to the birds, and the birds show up, and we put up the fencing, and, right? So there's a lot of conditions that have to happen here. If we did see behavior on the beach that's not allowed, right, prohibited behavior, we would work with local law enforcement, which is what we do across the state. We wouldn't say, hey, person that's living here, it's your job to control this person, because it is a public beach, and we work on, or it's not public, but it is a beach that has public access, right? And we work on these beaches all across the state and do the exact same work, which is, again, working with the town, law enforcement, if there are those activities that are undesirable. So there's not a situation where a landowner at, One Ocean Drive is supposed to be out there regulating any kind of activity. So hopefully that removes that piece. The other thing I want to say is that in terms of storms, if the beach looks like that video that we just saw, or there's potential for overwash or losing fencing, if there was fencing up, we would be out there adjusting it or removing it. We wouldn't be putting the beach in a situation where there's going to be marine debris. The fencing we use is resistant to washing out, but we can take one look at that habitat. I mean, we're at 190 sites across the state. We work with all different kinds of towns. We worked with Marshfield for many years. to make sure that we're not losing fencing. We know what habitat looks like. So as Leslie said, we can go out there and say, any of this is or isn't conceivable habitat. The other thing I wanted to bring up is that Mass Audubon as an organization is dedicated to beach access. So there's no place in the state that we go out and fence out the entire beach and say, we want to keep people off the beach. Our interest is birds and people sharing the beach and keeping our partners in compliance with permits. So you have this great big project happening, there's all these challenges and weather restrictions and timing and all these pieces, but it's a big project, and so our goal is to keep you in compliance. That means keeping eyes on the beach to see if the birds show up. And if there's prime habitat that we see if we go out next week, we would communicate with you, this looks like it's really, really great shorebird habitat. Like Leslie said, I don't see it when I look at these pictures. I'm familiar with this beach, it doesn't seem likely. But the idea is that we are that safety net, and we're here to support you and provide those protections should we end up in that situation, so that if there's more projects in the future, it sounds like there's a seawall project, there's other pieces coming up, that everything is in compliance and looks great. And it is shocking. A lot of these projects are happening across the state now. It is a big change. It is a big pill to swallow. That there might be fencing on the beach or the birds might show up. The population's doing really well, so to hear that loud and clear, and we have no interest. And it's not our job, right? If we work with the town of Duxbury, we work for the town of Duxbury. So it's in our best interest to work with you and make sure that we have, again, eyes on the beach. We protect the birds if they show up, if there's great habitat, but there's no version of how this plays out, at least in my mind, where we go out and fence out the entire beach. People can't access the beach. That's not a goal of the program. It's all about beach access and, again, sharing the beach. These birds do well when people are on the beach. So maybe that addresses a few concerns. If it doesn't, I still understand all of the concerns that are coming up. But our role, again, is to hit those compliance pieces like we do everywhere. So we've got the nice little checklist. Okay, Duxbury did this, this, and this. They're in compliance with this great big permit that they have. And we don't know if the birds will show up. That's the hard part. They did nest at Green Harbor last year in Marshfield, and of course, DBR. They are plentiful numbers of piping plovers nesting down there as well. But this will just let us know if they are at all, if they're showing interest there, and we also would be communicating consistently with whoever is the best contact on exactly what we're seeing. We might notice other interesting things on the beach in terms of birds or sand movement and things like that. All of these things would be pieces we're documenting. So we'd be in place to keep the town in compliance, to support you, and it's not our mission or our program's role to come in and close off the beach. So hopefully that puts your mind at ease. Remember that Duxbury Beach Reservation is very different, and they have very different requirements that they have to meet. They're an HCP site. If you want to know about that, I can talk to you after the meeting. A Habitat Conservation Plan site. They are a driving site. They're a site that's just incredibly different. So any of the feelings or thoughts or associations with Duxbury Beach Reservation, think they're doing great work over there. It's not the same. It's not the same, and we work at a lot of beaches across the state where there are lots of private landowners with deeded access to the beach, and we have to try and maintain that even if plovers do show up, which we don't know if they will. So I can answer other questions if they come up. I just wanted to throw a couple things out there. Yes?
You heard in Leslie's presentation that probably the best idea is if the folks want to put their ramps out, we can do it now or before April 1st. Imagining for a moment that they've got a ramp off the wall, would Mass Audubon entertain the idea of doing the symbolic fencing on either side of the ramp to allow sort of a pathway to the beach so they can still keep their ramp there and then just kind of cordon that area off on either side?
Exactly. So that's a great way of putting it. Beach access is what we're interested in, supporting beach access. So unless a piping plover nests directly in front of someone's staircase, which is highly unlikely, but if we end up in that scenario, the ask is that we would protect that nest as per the guidelines, and you might use your neighbor's passageway. But if any of you ever visit Newberry Beach on the North Shore, for example, Sagamore Beach and Sandwich, there's a lot of them where we do have hundreds of paths down to the beach. And so we're doing different sections of fencing. The priority is leaving the paths open and letting people access the beach. That includes places where, there might be a way for, folks of varied abilities to access the beach, like really small kids, can't use the stairs, things like that. So that's the goal, and that's what we'd be looking to do if that's great habitat, if the birds show up, is to keep those paths open.
And just so everybody's clear, what's the isolation distance from where the bird is nesting?
It's supposed to be 50 yards. That's what's in the state and federal guidelines. But it's kind of a laugh, right? Because the beaches we have in Massachusetts now, there's very few of them that we can actually hit that size. So what Mass Audubon would do is, and again, we have to do the if we meet all of these conditions and we have birds nesting somewhere, we would try to work with the landowners on the fencing, or the folks that own those houses. We would try to make the fencing as reasonable as we can without the bird flushing off the nest. So an example would be if there's a bird, in this front chair here, and me standing here has no impact on it at all. That's really at the discretion of the monitors. So we're gonna look to be in compliance with state and federal guidelines as close as we can, but let's say there's a path over on this side of the room, and where all the AV equipment is, and people wanna use this path, and this bird doesn't seem to be reacting to that at all. And we have the fencing maxed out, the state's happy with it, that's something we would try to do. So there is a little bit of flexibility if we are in compliance with all of the other steps here, because otherwise, 50 yards around a nest on this beach is gonna take up most of it. And if you look at all of the municipalities we work with, it's about 45 towns across the state, there's almost nowhere we can do that because it would restrict access to the beach to a really extreme level.
Yeah, because I'm sure that the fear that, I won't say fear, but the concern that some of the folks in this room may have is one that I've experienced for the last 11 years is once you get one bird and then you isolate it, it's going to create an area for more birds to come in behind it. And I've seen it happen over the last 11 years that I've been here. We've gone from 17 nests to 46.
We became a victim of our own success with piping plover
Actually,
management.
our former harbor master, Don Beers, used to say that. In
Yeah.
fact, he told me that the first month I was here and I had to close the beach for 30 days because a bird landed in the parking lot. I was like, really? Okay.
They won't nest in super close proximity to each other, because
I
they're
know,
pretty
they're
territorial.
territorial.
And it's true with the birds that fledged at Green Harbor last year, it'll be interesting to see where they go. But with limited habitat, it would be, and who knows, maybe this beach will continue to build up, maybe the projects of this nature will move forward and there'll be more habitat. Right now, it doesn't seem to me, and I'm speaking as someone that has not seen the beach post-nourishment, it does not look like a site that can support that many pairs, but as you said, the population is really skyrocketing, so it's interesting.
At least it is a DVR, hopefully not here though, for these folks' sake.
Statewide, it is, statewide, yeah.
With regard to the timing of the seawall, it's, again, we're slated to construct mid to end of May. Tell me about how this is going to impact that.
That will be up to state and federal wildlife agencies, luckily. That's out of our hands. We're here to do the monitoring as is needed by the town and to provide, our expertise. But I would say that if we hit that scenario where there are nesting plovers, to me it feels, I don't want to promise anything, it feels relatively unlikely with the kind of habitat, but I've been surprised many times while working for Mass Audubon if there were vehicles or construction that were causing a take to nesting piping plovers. So that means harming, harassing, disturbing, keeping from nesting, precluding them from foraging, forcing them off their nests. That would be something that the state and federal wildlife agencies would step in and likely say, you have to stop doing that work while this bird completes its nesting cycle. It would also mean that the bird would have to be close to where that seawall construction is happening, right? So the odds of, I don't know where that project is planned for, but it would
Right on
have
the
to be
seawall.
within range, along the whole thing.
Yes,
Yeah,
it's
so I
replacing
think
the seawall.
if those conditions occur, right, so if we have nesting plovers and there's seawall construction, that would be up to regulatory folks on how they want to pursue that.
Okay.
I just want to clarify one thing. So that requirement there that you just said, it would be up to the state and federal agencies, that's got nothing to do with the beach nourishment project at that point.
That's anywhere, that's
Anywhere.
any beach, anywhere.
So,
Yeah.
Correct.
okay, just want to clarify that.
I'm just asking that because I know a lot of the people here live along the seawall and they're probably going to
Sure.
wonder, hey, are we going to get this thing this year? Because the other part of the timing was we were hoping to do construction if it isn't in mid to early May, then it would be in the fall sometime. But then we have other friends coming to visit us called lease terns. Now, do you get involved with that aspect as well?
Yes, those are state listed species, so the terns will also be taken into account should terns nest along this stretch. I would say, again, the habitat, crazier things have happened, but it seems unlikely that a least tern colony would settle into this area. They do show up in May, as you said, and their season can be variable. It's a little more asynchronous than some of the plover nesting we see, but same thing. That would really be up to. So in that case, it would just be state wildlife because they are state listed species. But with piping plovers, we have state agencies and federal agencies because they are federally protected species. So there's some levels there.
You had mentioned that you folks have worked on 190 sites statewide. Is that current?
That is, yes.
How many of those did you walk away from where you didn't find anything? You said
That's a great question.
Like, how'd you
Any
get to
given
190?
year-
Were you originally like at 230 and there were 40 of them, they said, oh, there's nothing here, we can go away?
That's a great question. When the Coastal Waterway Program started, 1986, that's when the plovers were first listed, we had nowhere near that many sites. When the plovers were first listed, there were about 135 pairs in the state. Now there's 1,173. It's preliminary numbers from the state. So there's been sort of this exponential growth, and we have taken on more and more sites. I would say out of 190 sites, around 75% of them might be active in a given year. So a lot of those sites, you know, that other 25, 30%, those might be towns, landowners that have hired us to say, we want to be in compliance with our beach raking, our vehicle use, our sand movement. You know, they have different kinds of permits. So we go in there, we check, are there any birds? No, they're not. So we're checking those for projects, and we're also checking during something that's called a statewide census window. And the entire state checks almost every piece of habitat in the same 8 days in June to understand the population of these species and how they're changing. And that's to really avoid like a double count. So there might be a pair that moves from DVR to Green Harbor, but if we're serving everything on the same day, we get that nice little snapshot. So a lot of these sites, it's exactly right. We're looking at them, we don't see any activity, but we can say, oop, we checked it, right? And if there are birds at that site, we're protecting them so that on behalf of the landowner. So the landowner knows that there's a nest that's protected, and they're not responsible if those protections are out. Now, responsibility would change if they went and had a luau with fireworks and a drag racing competition on the beach and drove to the fencing right. I mean, there's things a landowner could do that would potentially be in violation of the Endangered Species Act. That doesn't happen along this stretch, but that's the place where landowners become responsible, even if protections are in place, if they did something really, really crazy. We almost never see that. So.
In terms of the concept of proactive versus observational fencing, what is it that you would do?
Here, I would love to take a look at the site. I know that Leslie mentioned we'd like to come out and look at it. The entire site, I don't at this point think that it makes sense to go out and proactively fence this entire site, that there's not available habitat. That would be my approach at this time. If we go out there and we see that there are some pockets of really, really great habitat, I would recommend we protect those temporarily. Take a look, see what bird activity does. We're out there multiple times a week. We're always adjusting fencing, changing it, and that way we cover our bases. You mentioned something earlier where you said, I prefer reactive fencing, which I understand, but...
No, I prefer observational.
Oh, observational, reactive are the same thing.
I do not prefer proactive.
So there's reactive and proactive.
Oh, sorry.
Reactive is observational.
Gotcha.
So you mentioned you prefer... Oh yeah, I think either term's great.
I think other folks in this room may like that as well.
Proactive versus reactive. Yeah, that's my understanding. And the reason that that's a tricky hair to split is because on busy beaches where there's lots of activity, if we don't have any kind of proactive protection, a bird could come and try to settle in and try to nest and never have the opportunity, right? And that might, probably no one cares here, right? Get out of here, bird. But the problem is that delays the nesting season, right? So if a bird's trying and it's too busy and we've got folks walking through and setting up their beach chairs and dogs running around, that bird isn't necessarily going to say, I give up. It's probably going to keep trying in the same area, and that just delays it. So part of the interest that most partners have in allowing us to proactively fence some areas is please get the season done early, right? And I don't blame any of our partners for that. Like, we'd love to get these birds in and out by July 4th. Like, that's the goal, right? So if we can protect them
Preaching
earlier.
to the choir. I'm a guy that sells stickers for a living. Trust me.
So I think that sometimes we'll say, if we can, we expect birds to show up, not here, but with some of our other partners, we think they're going to show up, let's get them well on their way in April, right? So by the time the chicks go, hatch and fledge, it's the peak of summer and the fencing's gone. That's best case scenario. But I think that's the case for reactive fencing, for proactive fencing, along with let's make sure that we're keeping everything in compliance. We won't know until we take a really good look at the site. At some of the pictures Leslie shared, I think there's not a lot of habitat in some of them. Maybe there's a little marginal habitat in some areas. So I think that could be a decision we make. And again, it can't be temporary. Like, none of this fencing is here for the whole season. We're trying to maybe protect some habitat that looks great, and then we'd be constantly looking at it, changing it, pulling it in. Some of our sites, there's like a big tide, we'll pull it in if there's a storm coming. All of our staff, we have like about 45 seasonal staff in the state, we all run out, we try and adjust the fencing so that we're not losing it. So it's a pretty intensive process, but that's because, again, we want to provide that access, we want to make sure that the birds are protected and we're hitting all those pieces during the intense couple months of the field season.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Can I ask one question while you're still on the microphone? I'll try to speak loud enough, but it's a short question. It's
Sorry,
about-
still into the microphone.
Sure.
Sorry, thank you.
No worries. Fall 40, Garden Road. So You mentioned about private ownership relationships that you have in Chatham and other private areas. Would you be willing to give us the name of the person and have a contact so that people that are much more involved in this than I am in the neighborhood can talk to them, see how that relationship's gone,
Yeah.
see, you know, how the back and forth has been, are there any blind sides, is the communication great? Those kind of things would be super helpful.
We, and that's a great question, I think, and I can't remember if we.
Sorry, when you build this, a little bit.
Oh, no, I'm sure that.
Oh, yeah.
Sorry, you guys, I'm sorry, we're not, I'm not very good at
Okay,
this.
folks, good.
Back and forth. So, yes, we can absolutely provide references both of other organizations we work with and private landowners. But keep in mind, there's a really specific nuance here, and that is that some of the landowners we work with are not involved in any kind of permitting project at all. They just happen to have piping plovers show up on their beach, on their land. And so in those cases, we're reaching out to them, we're asking for permission to be on their property, and we're asking for permission to protect those plovers to keep them in compliance. That not associated with any permit at all. So there is a little bit of a difference when there is a permit that requires it. And we also have folks that are in situations where there's a permit that requires it that we can share, certainly. But just, I think that's important distinction, because there are situations, if you're a private landowner and you don't have any kind of permit or, you know, anything that has anything to do with the Wetland Protection Act or things like that, the rules are can be a little different.
Another question.
Do you want to sit up here and that way they can use that mic?
Oh, yeah, I think that does.
Another question for you. If you go out there and you take your initial observations and you see nothing, then what? What do you do next year?
Next year at the site?
Yeah.
So we would do the same thing. Really, if we, in a scenario where we set up any kind of proactive fencing, if we don't see activity, we'd be keeping really close eyes on that and removing it, especially when we hit the threshold of really the end of plover nesting season, which if plovers haven't nested by July 7th, it's very unlikely that they will. Terns can nest later than that, but again, that's a big if. And next year, I think we'd have the same approach, but I think the bonus of that is we'd have 1 year under our belts, and we would know more about the site, we'd feel more familiar with it, our communications, all of those pieces would be hopefully a little more well-oiled at that point too, so there would be maybe more of a level of hope to get to know folks out on the beach. I mean, our staff are, you know, young scientists who are qualified shorebird monitors, and they're wonderful. They care a lot about the environment, and they tend to get to know folks along the stretch. So we'd have an idea of preferences and who comes out when, and this is a spot that always gets overwashed, or there's a giant rock here. So I think we'd have a little more know-how and be slightly more prepared. And we'd see, I mean, it would depend too on this year. So and you said if no nesting occurs. So if no nesting occurred, it would be the same approach, and we'd see how that goes.
So the no net, okay.
Because no nesting this year doesn't necessarily mean no nesting next year.
Right, so how many years would you be monitoring?
I'm not sure it depends on what the 3, okay.
3, okay, so if you see nothing in 3 years, that's it?
That's it, yep.
Okay. How many people show up on the first visit? I just want folks in the audience to know, so that if they see people crawling all over, they know what they're doing.
Well, also, all of us will be wearing Mass Audubon gear. So everyone has a name tag, so you know who they are. Mass Audubon name tag, hat, shirt, vest, etc. So they'll never look like there's someone that you don't know on your property or somebody poking around. Typically monitors work alone, but on the first visit, I think potentially 2 of us might go just to get eyes on the site and learn a little bit more, and we can let folks know when that would happen, the first sort of initial, we'll check things out. And then after that, it would be one of our South Shore crew members visiting the site.
Is it, I can't remember, is it a 1-to-1, one monitor per bird or per nest? I can't remember.
That's not, maybe Gina Patel, our Southeast manager, has used that before. I typically don't assign, if we needed 1 monitor per nest, we would need a lot more seasonal staff than we already have. So usually we have a collection of sites, and on the South Shore we work with a number of towns, so Situate, Hull, Marshfield, Cohasset. So what we do is we typically hire staff to make sure we can hit the correct number of visits and that we're not missing anything, because that would also be a scenario we don't want to end up in, is if we miss a nest, if we're not getting to a site often enough and we miss a nest, and then we're in a really tricky situation. That almost never happens, and that's because our staff follow a really specific schedule that's outlined by our program manager.
Okay, thank you.
One thing I'd like to recommend is that when you do that initial site visit, if either someone from the town, I don't know, Randy, if you want to have someone join them, or if you want someone from Woods Hole Group to go, so that we can communicate back to the town and the town can communicate to the residents what was decided. Does that is that okay with Mass Audubon, and then is that?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
However it works best for the town. I mean, really, it's our job to be here for you, so we can be very flexible in that if we're just taking photographs, or if we want to discuss afterwards, or, you know, I think there's a lot of ways this could play out. And again, the goal is to hit all of the pieces we need to be in compliance, and also be as, use this word, like inobtrusive. We're not out there with a megaphone or anything, right? We have just binoculars, we're looking mostly at the ground, we're looking for tracks of piping plovers, we're listening with our ears, taking a look around, and then headed out. So we're not having a picnic on the beach or anything like that. There's no prolonged stay. And I think that would comfort me, right, if I felt like this was my little slice of beach, and I wouldn't want, you know, a group of 10 people having a barbecue, where I like to have my peace and quiet. So it is an in and out, typically, situation.
Rainey, if you can think of another way to facilitate that initial site visit or some other model, then just let us know.
Yeah. If we know when it's happening, I can send an email to one or two people in this room, and I'm sure they'll help me get the word out.
Great.
And Greg, you as well?
Yeah, it'll be Cindy Castro and
Okay.
I'm going to continue to push back a little here on this. It's in black and white on this official document. Symbolic fencing installation on known plover breeding territory. I don't know how much more clear this can be. And I think Rainey is absolutely right. Why are we fencing unless we see a problem? It doesn't make any sense. You're gonna put fencing up, and shortly thereafter, there's going to be construction vehicles. If you have a high tide and it hits the wall, which will absolutely happen, what's the point of even putting it back? Because we know birds aren't going to, they're not nesting underwater. So at some point, this just doesn't, like, the logic doesn't make sense to me.
They've given up on me. Oh, here I am. I understand your questions, but from our perspective, us coming out and doing what we do, which is our monitoring and protection of piping plovers, is to keep you in compliance with the existing permit. So having eyes out there and protecting habitat when the species are essentially recolonizing large swaths of the state. Green Harbor, birds showed up there after many, many years of absence. Sandy Beach and Cohasset, Pleasant Beach and Cohasset. I could go on. So there are sites that, let's say, maybe 100 years ago, maybe more, there were piping plovers, and with the increasing population, they are showing up lots of interesting places, including parking lots, including private land, public land, all across the state. So the idea, if you can think of us as a safety net, right? Think of us as, again, the interest is not we're gonna come here and we're gonna build ourselves a nice fence and feel great about it. That's not the intention. The intention from my perspective is you have a permit, you need a qualified shorebird monitor. There are a couple organizations in the state that do it. Mass Audubon just happens to be the largest because we have infrastructure across the state, islands, South Coast, etc. So there's nothing, and maybe this is comforting, there's nothing frivolous about the activities we do. If some place is going to be underwater at high tide, we're not going to fence it. If we have concerns about fencing being washed out, we're going to remove it. But having eyes on the site will allow us to know if piping plovers are showing any kind of interest. One good example of this is that they will show up in prospect before anything happens. So if we're taking a stroll along the beach with our binoculars in our gear and we see a male piping plover that's calling, that's engaging in territorial behavior, a light bulb is going to go on over our heads that they're showing some interest in the site. Even if they don't show up and nest, we know that there are piping plovers potentially utilizing the site, and that's really important information when it comes to projects of this nature, the seawall. But again, it's not there's no thought process from our perspective that, wow, we really want the seawall project to happen. Instead, the idea is that if we have close enough monitoring and we are meeting conditions, then these projects can happen, right? And we've done all kinds of, actually a stair building process happened on the North Shore recently. So we've been the monitor to facilitate those projects, to allow projects to happen, to allow restoration to happen, not the opposite, which is we want to try and stop things from happening. Because these projects, seawall projects, all kinds of restoration, dredging, plantings, this is the future, this is where we are. We're losing habitat at really, really rapid rates across the state, and plovers are just wrapped into that. They're just a part of that equation. And it's tough when you engage with a really great, big, monumental project, and this is just another requirement, but they're all wrapped together because we have plovers using habitat across the state, even suboptimal habitat, which is what we call it. They've showed up in some places where, like, those birds are not going to do well there, but we still have to protect them to remain in compliance with the State and Federal Endangered Species Act and with any associated permit at the site. And then we can say, we did our due diligence. You know, we came in, we looked for them, if we found habitat they could potentially use, we checked to make sure they weren't using it, and that's that. So I really do hear your concerns, and I don't know anything about these sort of first round of conversations about this, but that's our perspective.
Okay, so as I understand it, plovers kind of scope out where they want to be for the next season. Is that true?
They can,
Okay.
not necessarily. So sometimes at the end of the season, we might see various piping plovers prospecting in the area, popping around, you know, but that's not any guarantee that will be where they show up. Typically, plovers return to their natal ground, so where they were hatched, which makes me a little suspicious about our Green Harbor friends last year. We'd like to see those chicks fledged, so it'll be interesting to see when those birds come back up, if they go and they end up in this general vicinity, do they get sent over into DBR? We're not sure where that will happen, but when an adult male plover comes in and does something called a scrape, maybe some of you have heard this, they create a nest bowl in the sand. And each and every one of those nest bowls has to be protected under the state and federal endangered species guidelines. So in a way, if you think about us being detectives, right? We're looking for that scrape so that we can protect it and keep everything in compliance because eggs could be laid in that scrape at any time. That's getting into the weeds a little bit. There's a lot more info out there about piping plovers, but the idea is that we catch it. We're that safety net.
Okay, well, I mean, let's go into the assumption that just construction alone is going to keep them away this season. So let's just say nothing happens, because in all likelihood it won't. And then next year is the second year you're required to monitor, and the birds come to scope out for the third year. What happens if birds happen to show up the third year? What's going to happen the fourth year? If we wind up with birds because we're fencing and we're giving them an invitation to come, what will happen the fourth year and the fifth year? Are we now going to have a plover problem like the DBR does?
I wouldn't call it a problem.
Well, it is a problem. It's a problem to us. The birds have taken over, and the birds seem like they're thriving, and I personally would like to know how and when we can get them off the endangered list.
I can speak to that, that's because you have to activate it, that's why. Genius is over there, thank you. I can speak to two of those things. Oh, so the first thing you said about construction, the idea would be that wouldn't be something, if the universe exists where the plovers nest and then construction starts, there wouldn't be a precedent, they wouldn't be allowed to essentially deter plovers from nesting with construction, right? Because that's a take under ESA with or without the permit. So I just want to say one thing, we can't deter plovers unless you're part of the ACP. Again, that's a story for another day. Is there a world in which plovers show up any of these years? Yes. Are we building them a plover hotel with adding sand? Possibly, right? So that's part of the tricky thing to start. With or without the fencing, these plovers might show up, and with or without this project, plovers might show up, because that's happening everywhere. So in that situation, this is what's happening all over the state. Plovers show up, and they do become the responsibility of the landowner. They can work with Mass Audubon, they can work with other organizations to make sure that those birds are protected. But I will agree with you and say that is a big challenge of being a coastal landowner in Massachusetts, private, municipal, state, you name it. There's a responsibility that comes with plovers that show up whether or not there's a permit of any kind. And they could show up even without this project. They could show up without fencing and lay eggs.
Okay, so the area in front of Ocean Road South is technically protected under NEHSP because it's within, that's why we have to do the construction after September 1st for the seawall. We're supposed to start at Cable Hill, go north, and then double back after September 1st and do the construction in front of Ocean Road South.
Okay.
We're talking about nourishing, if we have money, right, every 5 years or such,
Hopefully we'll-
depending on material and so forth. And we're obviously bringing it further and further down south. What happens when sand lands in front of that area? What are we now, kind of classified more like the DBR because that's, that's more of a restricted area? Do we need to be careful in that?
I guess I'm not sure what you're asking.
Well, it seems like Ocean Road South has some restrictions in front of it that are more protected. So if we put sand down in front of that area, what does that mean for us as residents who live on Ocean Road South?
It means bird monitoring, just like what we've talked about here tonight.
So there's no extra concern there. We're not in danger of that part of the beach being closed.
Ocean Road South is like you're talking like immediately north of DVR
Yes.
property?
Yes.
So if you nourish that area, you're gonna have the same requirements that we have currently.
Yeah, they come hand in hand. So when you're creating Plover Hotel is another way of thinking about it. That's the added responsibility. But the I don't know if irony is the right word for it, is that they could show up just like they've showed up at Green Harbor in places where there's no nourishment whatsoever, and there's still a state and federally protected species. And in those scenarios, again, it's the monitor's job, it's the organization that's helping you and that potentially spots this bird to work with you and give you information on what plover protection is and the different forms it takes. And again, as I mentioned, we work with a lot of private landowners that, surprise, the plovers have shown up. And I would say that it's, I think something like, and this might be hard to believe, but these are the facts, is approximately 97% of the folks that we interact with on the beach, it's a positive interaction. We're sharing information about the rules, we're educators, we're scientists, we're not regulators, we're not enforcement, we're not environmental police officers, we're none of those things. So we want to work with folks to find solutions and to make sure the protection's in place. And the beach is, I live on Cape Cod, the beach is essential and very important to all of us, that we get to spend time at the beach and enjoy the place where we live. So I've got plovers on the beach down the street from my house, so I understand, and it might seem that Mass Audubon is coming in and having grand delusions of grandeur. We want this whole stretch to be covered in plovers, and that's not realistic, nor is it the goal.
How can we get them off the endangered list if they're doing well? And, or are they naturally due to come off anyway just because they're the population?
It might be a little bit outside the purview. I mean, I kind of wanted to clarify one thing, that Alicia,
Yeah.
you keep holding the permit up, saying that we only have to fence on area, the permit says, we only have to fence on areas that have had birds before.
Right.
It also goes on to say that if there are birds that arrive and show territorial behavior or nest, they've got to be fencing. So that's exactly why Rainey is pushing for reactive fencing.
Yes.
Okay,
yes.
so I think that's
Yes.
where we're going.
Okay.
And I don't want people to think that, you only have to fence if there's been birds there the year before. That's not the case.
Okay.
If they show up, display territorial behavior, it's got to be fenced.
Okay, and so, not to
By the way,
be a problem here.
I tried that angle too, Alicia,
Okay.
about a month ago.
All right.
Didn't work,
And
so
this is not
I'm with
direct,
you.
this is not directed at you personally, I'm just, I think I've had several people reach out to me in advance of this meeting, so I'm speaking for myself and also some other people. In terms of the easements that we signed, maybe the semantics weren't perfect, but I think the town and Valerie knew where we were going and what we were asking for and how we were trying to protect ourselves when we signed that easement. And I think that we're getting, we're getting through here on technicality. And I really don't think that it's fair. I feel a little taken advantage of, to be perfectly honest. And I'd like to know, going forward with future nourishment, this to me sort of voids out those easements that we agreed to. So going forward, how can we work together more with this? Because I personally would like to take my easement right now, to be perfectly honest with you.
Let me cover some of that. So way back when we were trying to get the seawall built, everybody that now enjoys the benefit of it being there had to sign off on construction easements. We couldn't do it without that. So that was part of the whole project, not just for the FEMA part, but the whole shooting match. So without the construction easements, we were dead in the water. So everybody signed off on them. I have that email. I saw that you had sent it. It's not a question of semantics. It's not at all. In fact, the kind of fencing that was described here is very different. In fact, you can go to DVR right now and see it there. It's sand fencing. It's the wooden stakes with the wire interwoven. It's not the same as the kind of fencing that we're talking about here, which is the sacrificial fencing. The symbolic fencing. I always get the word wrong. They're very different. Symbolic is simply strings going from one stick to another for birds. The other kind of fencing that Val was talking about was, for dune nourishment. That's what they use. I mean, if you go, my family all lives in Hummerock.
Yeah.
They used to have for years, we'd throw the old Christmas trees in front of it, and create the dune, and did that for years and years and years, and it builds it up. That kind of fencing is very different. And it also, that email also discussed the idea of putting plants in, and the planting material, that was also covered. Neither one of those things is happening here. This is separate, distinct, and apart from that. When we began this journey 5 years ago, I had no idea we were going to wind up here. No one did. Because now we've got a seawall, and to have the seawall, we have to have the easements first. But then once you build the seawall, there's a condition that says, okay, you can have the seawall, but you've got to do the nourishment. We said, okay, fine, we'll do that. With the nourishment comes this requirement that we've got to do the monitoring. Okay, that's part of the whole thing. It's a learning process for us all. 5 years ago, I had no idea that we'd be standing here tonight talking about symbolic fencing for plovers. I don't think anybody did. Because we've learned as we've gone along. It's the first time we built a seawall in this town in 60 years. Nobody was alive when the last one was built. Maybe there's a few people, but there was certainly no kind of permitting the way we have now. It's very different. It's a very different world, with a different game. So we're learning as we go. I don't think anybody was misled. I think that the email stands on its own. I've got it right here if anybody needs to see it. It's accurate. There's nothing wrong. Nobody was misled. It is not a case of semantics. It's a case of very different fencing.
I know. I understand it is different. I understand that now. But when the easements were on the table, I myself really didn't understand the difference between symbolic fencing and sand fencing. Fencing and restricting areas for birds. You can see that a lot of the conversation was concerning creating habitat and birds. And so it all sort of falls under the same umbrella as far as I'm concerned. And I have to say, as a member of the Seawall Committee, Candy and I, we killed ourselves to get people to send those easements back on time for you. And we talked to our neighbors, we reassured them, we encouraged them to sign it, we talked about the greater good and all of the positive things that would happen on the beach as a result of that. And I have to say, I really am feeling very conflicted about that right now. I have a lot of people that are pretty upset.
I understand. I've lived with this kind of situation ever since I started working here, but in a different area, not here. It's tough. It's not what we prefer. We would prefer a very different arrangement, but this is the price you've got to pay to play the game. It's part of the deal. We wanted the wall. The wall is being built. We've got 1/3 of it up. We've got 2/3 left to go. This is how it has to happen. I'm trying to do all I can to make the impact as minimized as possible for anybody that lives along the seawall, because I know you guys have already been through enough. I just want to get the seawall done for you, then get the sand out there, and maybe there are no birds. Maybe in 3 years there's nothing to see, but the problem we'll be faced with is the nourishment, not the problem. The situation we'll be faced with is the nourishment is going to be an ongoing cycle for quite some time until we get to the threshold that we have to hit. So every time we dump more sand out there, we're creating a situation where we could have potentially greater habitat. It's just what happens. There's nothing we can do about it. And you had asked about the delisting of plovers. Just I'll tell you right now, it's not a fight worth fighting, because Chris has done a terrific job at the DBR covering that subject on at least 3 occasions with public forums. The biggest one she had was when she rented out the PAC about 1.5 to 2 years ago. And that question was asked, and it's an uphill struggle. And I don't see it happening in our lifetime. I think to think that it would is kind of silly.
Right.
And I think if anybody thinks that they're going to get plovers delisted is dreaming. Lease terns, there's more of them, but they're not in the same boat as plovers. But I think you're better off. I think anybody that wants to pursue the idea of getting plovers delisted off the endangered species list would spend their energy in better places. That ain't it.
Okay. So where are we at then with this fencing? Are you still discussing it, or?
Well, yeah, that's like I had said. I hadn't signed the contract yet because I wanted to meet with Lyra and I wanted to see how this all plays out, see where they're heading, and I'll have additional conversation with them. I would be silly not to hire Mass Audubon to come and do this because they're the experts. I don't have these people. I don't have staff that does this.
Right.
We have Nancy as our conservation agent, but this is not her forte, nor is it mine. You hire third-party experts to do this kind of stuff, and you hope that it plays out the way we hope it plays out.
Right. And so who would Mass Audubon be reporting to? Are they reporting to Woods Hole Group, or
The
they're
town.
reporting to the town?
Yeah.
To the town. So who would the point person be for that, without a planner? Would that be Sheila?
To be determined. We'll find out. We'll figure that out.
Okay. So you're still discussing then whether you're going to do reactive fencing or proactive fencing?
Yes.
Okay.
Like I had said, I think you folks have been through a lot down there, and my goal would be to try and minimize any further impacts if we can.
Rick Gruber, I grew up on 57 Ocean Road North. My grandparents bought it in 1938. And I grew up there. I live on the street in another house. But I'm 74 years old. I was there before they built the first seawall.
My offense. Don't take offense to what I said earlier. I'm glad you're here.
So I am still alive.
It's good to have you here.
So I can never ever remember seeing a baby bird, any animal, trying to nest or live on that side of the seawall. Since before this first seawall went in, the ocean used to go up further than the seawall. And every year during the summer, the ocean at moon tides and stuff comes up and hits the seawall. That's why you could never leave your toys, you could never leave a raft down there because it wasn't going to be there possibly in the morning, because if you didn't get the tides right, it was going to be gone. So, you know, I don't want to burst your bubble, but I don't think you're going to have anything nesting out there.
It's not going to get any better than this. I mean, come on, let's adjourn right here.
The other thing that's going to happen, if you think you're going to build a sand dune in front of that seawall, that ocean is going to take it in one tide and bring it out. And years ago, what used to happen, what used to protect our cottages more, was that the waves, the tide used to go out further because there was more sand further out. And we had white water breaking during the storms hundreds and hundreds of yards away, and it didn't come to the seawall with any energy. It hit the seawall and rolled up. But now, the waves would come right up within 100 feet before they'd even break. And then when they hit the seawall, they'd end up going over the houses. Because I was there during the no-name storm. Okay, and I watched all those houses fall down. So, you know, you thinking that a bird is gonna live there, they're never gonna nest in front of that seawall. They're gonna move down to the sand dunes. You're gonna have to put rafts out there for them to sit on. I'm telling you, it's never gonna happen.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
I just have a short question. So could you advance to a slide near the end? The number was 19 on the upper right corner of the slide. I don't know if that's the slide number, but that was the page number that it was on. It's near the end. It's almost the last slide. Yeah, so that one. Well, no, I don't know if you zoomed it. There you go, that one there. So, no, that's 20, the one before. So, the passion's obviously in the subject pretty high. I think everybody realizes that. And, you know, there's been some blind sides from the sounds of it, misunderstandings, whatever you want to call them. But there have been some, and there likely to be more. You know, trust is really essential on this whole kind of thing. I can imagine it must be the things that you deal with, you as well, and your passions of what you want, the passions of what the people on this side of the room really want are much different. And let's be honest about that, okay? The slide here says responsibilities, Mass Audubon to monitor and educate the public and enforce at a local level. When we listen to some of the words that have come out, and some of the discussion that come out, you know, educating and monitoring is turned into enforcing, placing fencing at the discretion of the monitor, having a say on where ladders go, 50-foot blocked areas for the sign of anything. I mean, 50 feet is a long way, especially when one incident begets 50 feet. another incident over here that gets 50 feet. Pretty soon it's 500 feet. So all I would ask is that when you put materials out and you put slide decks together, be as informative as you possibly can on this stuff, because that's vague to me. Those responsibilities of Mass Audubon people are far greater than those 2 bullet points say.
Okay, fair point, yep,
You know, because that's what's going to whip up passions and it's going to blow away trust.
yeah. Well, we did list what they were doing in the previous slide.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, thank you.
Or even the one before that, I guess. So this is the one where we listed the things that Mass Audubon will be doing as a part of their monitoring program. We didn't explicitly say Mass Audubon, but this is what's in, that's right there, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Am I up?
Yes.
Mark White, 25 Bay Ave. Just a question, when the survey is done, do you time that, or I would hope that you time it at a high tide period so that you can see, okay, great.
Yeah, we'll be strategic about that because A, we need to be able to pass. So, I mean, if it's all underwater, we're clearly not doing a survey that day.
Yeah.
So hopefully when we get to know the site a little bit better, we'll be able to time it so that we can actually see how high the water's coming, but we can also usually tell that even if we come at mid-tide, which is mid or low might be what I recommend to start, just so we get an idea of the lay of the land, and we can actually see how high that water line comes up. It's pretty evident, probably all of you can tell that as well, like, oh, I can't believe how high it came last night. We'll be able to know that just by looking at the sand.
Okay, good. Because even if we don't have high tide that hits the wall on a given day, certainly within 2 weeks, it's hitting there. And if it does hit the wall, then I understand then that negates it as potential habitat for nesting. Is that correct?
During that cycle. So these birds show up now. We've started seeing them on our shores in March. They're really starting to initiate nesting activity in April, and any time between April and July, they can initiate nesting. So there is a story or a possibility that birds fail over at DVR, let's say, for whatever reason. Maybe their nest gets predated, maybe it gets washed out by a storm. Those birds are going to be looking for someplace to re-nest, and that's why we often have a later wave of nesting. Sometimes beach profile might have grown by that point in the season. Habitat changes over the course of the season, as all of us know. So it wouldn't necessarily be like, oh, the water's hit the seawall, you know, we're done here for the season. We would still keep eyes on it, you know, just to also understand how the habitat's changing over the summer. Maybe still if a bird shows up, maybe it doesn't nest. So for that tide cycle, obviously it's out, and if there were eggs there, they're gone. And that's kind of what overall we would like the earlier attempts to succeed if they do occur, just because then they don't restart the whole process over again. They will re-nest up to 5 times. So let's get the first attempt moving and get them on their way. But obviously the tides are not up to us. If only they were different.
And another quick question, Renee, could you just remind us where specifically the construction is supposed to be happening in the first phase? You said the northern end, I think.
Yeah, I believe it's the northern end, closest to the Marshfield line, and then working south from there.
Okay. And you expect that construction would be actual construction activities?
Yeah, we hope to,
Sorry.
the idea would be, once we get our final permit squared away, is go out to bid next month,
Okay.
and then be able to break ground. This is best case scenario.
Right.
Mid to end of May.
Okay. Thank you.
Any other questions?
We have 20 attendees on Zoom, so if any of the virtual attendees would like to ask a question, please raise your hand. Nothing from the virtual.
All right, if there aren't any other questions, I'd like to just thank everyone for coming and, providing us with your input and feedback. I think it's really valuable. It's good to hear your point of view, and we will strive to keep the lines of communication open so that everyone understands what's going on the beach. Thank you very much.